McLaren is definitely in the fight, but is it too little too late? This is Turn 1. We're your host, Thomas.
And Jeremiah.
Typically, this part of the week, we would be releasing a full recap of the previous Grand Prix, which in this case would be the 2024 Spanish Grand Prix. We might touch on that a little bit, but there's bigger topics to cover this week, I think. That race was great. I think there was a lot of action to it, but what it really showed us is that McLaren is here to stay for this year and most likely next year. And so we want to look at a couple of things McLaren is doing right to get where they are. And then I'm going to throw some blind topics at Jeremiah, and me and him can either debate or agree on these, whatever it is, and ultimately resolve the question of, is it too little too late for McLaren? So, Jeremiah, before I get into that, what was your takeaways from the Spanish Grand Prix in terms of McLaren and their pace? What stood out to you about Oscar and Lando?
You know, when we first started this whole Oscar and Lando conversation, it really seemed like Oscar was right on the back of Lando Norris. And it feels like that is showing to be less and less true. And I think now that the car is better, Lando is actually able to show what he's been able to do all along, but never had the opportunity to. And Oscar is unfortunately paying the price for it, as he's getting bad jumps in qualifying, and then off the line, not really making too many positions up, although he had a good start in this race, but he's really not as competitive as Lando is being in these races. It's kind of a letdown, but we also have to take that with a grain of salt because of how young Oscar is.
And I don't even know if competitive is the right word. I think you kind of hit it from the start there, which is, I think Lando's got it. I think he's figured it out. Like whatever he did this past offseason, but kind of the last two seasons, because last year, remember in the middle of the year, it just clicked for McLaren with the car. I think it clicking with the car set him off on a new path of like, okay, now I can compete, right? Before, he always knew that he was in the fourth car, the fifth car, the third car on a good day. But end of last year, him and Oscar getting, Oscar won a sprint race. Lando was getting 7 podiums to close out the year, like 7 in the last 9 races in 2023. And then coming into this year, of course, they didn't have the great start right off the jump. They were a little bit behind Mercedes and Ferrari's pace. But I think he knew in his head, like, that team's got it figured out. This car's dialed in, and he put in the time to learn that car. Again, tough to say if Oscar's, like, he is behind, yes, but isn't this only his third year in the sport?
Second?
So was last year his first?
I believe so. So yeah.
So he's
exactly that.
He's crushing it right now. So I want to start looking at what McLaren is doing right. And the whole topic again is it too little too late? And I'll tease ahead in saying that McLaren's making a play for things now. And in all honesty, they're too late on 2024. Yes, Lando can probably get second. They can probably do well in the Constructors Championship, but they're not catching Red Bull this year. Max is too far ahead. I think it's a done deal, and you can disagree with me on that if you'd like to, but I think Max is still going to win, and I think Red Bull's still going to win. So they're making a play in my head for 2025, and we can save this for the end, but 2026, everything changes. So they're making a 1-year push in my head. Here's what they're doing right. Zak Brown. If you've listened to our show for any amount of time, I was calling for Zak Brown to lose his job middle of last season. And I was adamant that dude needs to be gone from McLaren. He has been at McLaren since the end of 2016. And in his time, they've never made it up to elite status. They've been nowhere near where McLaren expects for the resources and investment that they give that team. They have not been competing regularly for podiums. The last time they competed for wins was when Danny Rick was on their team, and that was even a one-off. And so ever since they've been in the Lando Norris era, it's finishing in the top 10, sure, but it's not finishing on the podium or winning races. I think he's pieced together a great team. I've got a couple of those pieces, but where were you at with Zak Brown last year, and where are you at with him now?
It's tough to say where was I at with Zak Brown, and not so much so like where I was at with McLaren in general. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to the one guy, but the team in general was just off, and it was off for years. Yeah, you had the Danny Rick one-off, and that was great, but they really haven't been hyper competitive. I mean, since Jenson Button in 2008 and Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso 2008 and 7. I said Jenson Button 8. It was 2009. Regardless.
Yeah.
Or no. Anyway,
We're pre 2010 here. The last time they were good.
yeah. So get back on track here. Bringing in Oscar Piastri as the number 2 guy and providing a car to Lando Norris to where now he can bring the fight to his old buddies from his lower series days, George Russell, Charles Leclerc, who have been getting the limelight as they made their moves to Ferrari and Mercedes. And George got his win in Brazil, and Charles Leclerc had that really good season against Max Verstappen in, what was that, 2022? It's just been Charles and George. But now that Lando is finally able to creep up there and bring the fight to them, Lando is now showing to be on par as far as driving skills. And now with a car that's provided that's better, honestly, he's showing out, and rightfully so, because in this time that he's been watching all of his friends succeed, he's just been sitting in the back, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And now he's getting his opportunity to shine and show everybody that he also belongs in this top driver conversation.
And I think, again, last year, him getting a somewhat competitive car, speaking about Lando, and then, like you said, watching Max win, 2022, watching Charles win, like all these guys that he grew up with racing against are getting it before him. It's like, come on, you know? And I think that sent him into another direction. So sticking on the Zak Brown train, but let's go into the drivers a little bit. Obviously, Zak Brown is the guy making these driver decisions. At least that's our understanding, is that he's the one making the driver decisions. Of course, they bring in Lando in 2018, and it was at the end of 2018. Yeah, he did a couple of things. He was like a reserve driver for them. Then he starts with them in 2019. You knew that he was like the next one, right? Like he's the next guy that's going to compete with Max, going to compete with Charles, came into the sport roughly the same time, a little bit after, but he just never had that car piece together. But time after time, they have committed to Lando being their driver. Most recently, early this year, late 2023, there was a big question mark around if Lando was going to stay with McLaren because they hadn't really put the pieces together yet. And what does McLaren do? What does Zak Brown do? They lock him up to another multi-year deal. Now, I looked up and down for how many years this contract is, and there is not a number on it. It just is multi-year. So it's a minimum of 2 years. We know that. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 years. Maybe he got the max like 6-year deal. I don't know, Verstappen's craziness, but they've got their guy.
Yeah, and here's where it gets harder too, is because when he comes into the scene of Formula One, he comes in as a McLaren driver. Charles Leclerc enters as an Alfa Romeo driver, then goes to Ferrari, then gets his wins. George Russell comes in as a Williams driver, stays at Williams for a while, then replaces Bottas at Mercedes, and then gets his win in Sao Paulo. And he has been, this whole time, while those two started on backmarker teams and worked their way up to the top, Lando has been on a quote-unquote front-running team, which, where has that been? They've been competing with Renault year after, Alpine, I guess now, but year after year after year after year. And finally, they have jumped out of that conversation and into the Mercedes-Ferrari conversation, and arguably, possibly in 2025, the Red Bull conversation.
Right. And so with Lando again, he's committing to McLaren as much as they're committing to him by signing a multi-year deal. So that goes back to Zak Brown and McLaren and all that. They found their guy. They're keeping him. Looking at the other driver, Oscar Piastri. We did an episode on this back when all this happened, but of course, this was one of the most masterful. I know Zak Brown's not the team principal, but CEO, team principal, whoever making your personnel decisions, most masterful move, stealing him away from Alpine. I mean, he ripped Oscar Piastri out of the Alpine system. And I mean, they had the whole legal battle. There was some disagreement on whether there was a settlement or no settlement. None of that really ever came out. But regardless, you won in that situation if you're Zak Brown and McLaren getting Oscar Piastri away from Alpine. Also, if you're Oscar Piastri, you won going to McLaren, a team that is clearly committed to improving. And you look across at the team you left in Alpine, they're improving, I guess, but it's slow.
Yeah, that's tough to say because you have Alpine, who were the worst car on the entire grid for 2024, and now with Spanish Grand Prix and the race before, they're now showing to be back in the midfield. That's where Oscar would have been. And, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly are both really good drivers. I would say probably on the same level of Oscar Piastri now as a youngster, even though they've been in the sport for a while, and Oscar's just going to go up and beyond that. But we see where Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly are finishing right now. That's where Oscar would have been. But to get this opportunity now to fight with the next cars in the next division up, with the Mercedes, with the Ferrari, and then pretty much every single race Sergio Perez. But that's besides the point. Getting
Every
that
other race.
opportunity to fight with these big dogs allows him to gain that experience and knowledge in those fights. That's just going to propel him to the next level. And if McLaren keep providing him with these cars back to back, even going into 2026 with the new regulation change, Oscar's going to grow into essentially another Lando, maybe better. That still remains to be seen, because as we see from Lando, he's getting better. So we don't know what Lando's ceiling is yet, in my opinion.
The only risk you run is if you're McLaren is if both of those guys are elite level drivers and you have produced a winning car, which they're on the track to do, then you get into the whole like who's going to win, is there team orders, who's getting the championship.
No.
And I'm not saying that's a risk. I'm saying your risk there is Oscar saying, or Lando saying, okay, I'm jumping ship because I'm tired of the whole politics of the team. But that's a really good problem to have.
Yeah, well, we get a repeat of the Alain Prost, Ayrton Senna phase of McLaren way back in the day, to where both drivers are trading off championships until one driver's like, hey, man, I want the spotlight. And so they jump ship. And that's a possibility. Like I said, we're far from that still. They don't even have the car yet to regularly win races, but that day could possibly come from McLaren.
Yeah, and again, that would be a really good problem. We almost saw it at Red Bull with Max and Daniel, but they didn't have the car. Like, it was still losing to Mercedes. The closest that I can think you've been to recently would have been Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, but Nico calls it quits after his championship. So you didn't get the continuation of that battle. After Lewis had his and then Nico gets his, it's like, well, where does this go from here? And then Nico's like, all right, I'm done with this. Let's
and maybe that's just
else.
what it is. When you have two drivers competing at the highest level like that, going back and forth and trading wins, maybe it's just one of those things where it's so taxing to the other driver that one of them eventually just gives. Maybe that's not a system that's built to win or built to last.
So there's 3 points. I got Zak Brown and then the two drivers, which are, both clearly committed. I think Oscar re-signed with McLaren as well for a new deal. And so they're all locked up. Let's look more into the personnel at the team that is just knocking out of the park. And there's been a couple of big moves on this. Some of these guys came into McLaren like 1 or 2 years after Zak Brown came in, but they've changed roles in that time. And I think the roles that they're in are playing really, really well. Andrea Stella, their actual team principal. Now, we don't get to see him very much. He's not a big part of Drive to Survive, the race day activities. He's behind the scenes and not doing the interviews and all that. He gets promoted to team principal in December of 2022. When did McLaren turn the page on their performance?
Probably, well, as far as turning the page in their performance, I wouldn't say until like 2023.
Right, middle of 2023. So he turned the page 6 months into his job. If he's hired in December of 2022 and they're competitive June, July of 2023, that's pretty good results for being the team principal for 6 months.
Especially with the fact that we know any team principal that immediately comes in should not and is not able to have exact immediate results, because you have to completely revamp everything. You have to form everything to how you want things to be, put people in place that weren't there initially, and that all takes time. So we don't expect immediate results. So 6 months is a pretty quick turnaround.
And I think it's because they had the car already made, which he wouldn't have had much of a say in. And then his only job there is putting people in the right place and upgrades. That's really all you have control of when you come in at that point in the season. So whatever he did in 2023 worked. And then, of course, as we come into 2024, again, the first, 4 or 5 races of the year, they were a little bit behind the pace. And then by race 5, which was
China.
Yeah, China. That's where they dialed it in. Lando got his first second place of the year after finishing 6, 8, 3, 5. So still not too far off the pace, but definitely up into another level, getting that second place finish. So Andrea Stella, the team principal, getting promoted up in 2022, had its role. These next two I actually didn't know about until we started looking into like what McLaren is doing to make this happen. Do you know who Rob Marshall is?
Can't say I do.
So we talked about Aston Martin picking off a couple of people from Red Bull, to rejuvenate their team and build that whole thing up. They weren't the only people picking off a Red Bull. Rob Marshall hits the McLaren scene January of this year, so January 2024, after being with Red Bull Racing for 17 years.
Oh.
So you think he knows how Christian Horner runs a team?
Yeah, I would imagine.
So Rob Marshall is the chief designer. The car is basically his.
Okay, so he was learning under Adrian Newey.
Yeah, he was on the Newey staff. He was on the Christian Horner staff. And so him joining in 2024, now again, he wouldn't have had a major say in this year's cars, but he's having a say in the upgrades. He's having a say in the people, and we're going to see his car next year. Like,
Which,
it's going to be
the
a Rob
upgrades
Marshall
is what
car.
propelled McLaren to the top of this season anyway, so.
Right, because McLaren's first upgrades this year, or their first major upgrades, were the first week of May, and that coincides perfectly with China and Miami, where Lando Norris kicked it up into another gear. The final one is Neil Houldey. He was made the technical director in 2024. Now, he's been with McLaren for over 15 years. He started in late 2000s, I guess. But he was part of the changes of bringing in Rob Marshall, and as it's Andrea Stella did this whole thing on like how he has a new re-envisioned team, and these two guys are the center points of that. So Neil is the technical director. Him and Rob, we still don't know all the ins and outs of these F1 roles, but Rob Marshall being the chief designer and Neil being the technical director, one's over the car design, one's over what goes in that car. They've got to work pretty well together to make it work. And right now, McLaren is making a car that is arguably on the same pace of Max Verstappen's Red Bull.
Yeah, I'd say it's still a little bit behind, but as far as all of the other cars on the grid, by far the closest. By far.
They're ahead of Sergio Perez's Red Bull.
Yeah, well.
As we saw in the Spanish Grand Prix, where Oscar flies past Checo and then finishes 26 some odd seconds ahead of him.
Jeez.
Not to mention Lando Norris, who's a good 2 minutes ahead of Checo. So those are the big people moves that we have. Here's kind of where I want to bring this home, and I want your thoughts on this. Not going to say is it worth it, because yes, it is. But what does it ultimately matter? Questions for you. Can McLaren get anything of relevance in 2024? If so, what is it? And in 2025, are they competing for a championship? In 2026, does everything go away?
Okay, start with the first one.
Yep.
2024. Do me a favor while I'm in this thinking process and talking. Pull up the Constructors Championship. And
okay, got it.
You already got it? Okay,
yep.
What are McLaren's points right now?
McLaren is at 237.
And Red Bull.
Ferrari is at 270. And Red Bull is at 330.
I don't care about Ferrari. So...
You think they're going to fly past Ferrari?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think McLaren takes number 2. And with, let's see, you said they're at 237?
They're 93 points off of Red Bull. With over half the season left.
Hear me out.
Okay.
Oh, God. Oh, hear me out. If Oscar Piastri finds form, starts finishing in the top 5 of every single race, maybe even top 4, honestly, I think they can make a play at Red Bull. It'll be tough, and they'll have to be majorly consistent, but I think they can make a play at Red Bull. Because here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that McLaren are the only team that has not had one driver DNF from a race this season?
I did not know that, but looking at the stat sheet, yeah, that does check out.
Yeah, only team. Only team. And if they can keep up that form, no mistakes. If Red Bull maybe has another mistake, another Sergio mishap, something like that, Sergio keeps getting out of the points or 10th place where he gets 1 point, you really only have Max getting the 25, and then if he gets the fastest lap, 26 over and over again. Now, if you have Lando coming in second of every single race and you have Oscar coming somewhere in the top 5, I think they can make a realistic play at Red Bull. I can guarantee you, well, that's tough to say also because Ferrari is good with upgrades. I can say there's a good possibility that they're going to pass Ferrari this season. I mean, it's going to be tough for Ferrari to catch up.
I agree with your stance on Ferrari. Let me real quick combat. I'm going to combat your point. So yes, if Lando is alternating wins with Max, and Oscar's finishing in the top 5, and Sergio does what he's done in the past 4 races, yeah, they 100% have a play at Red Bull. Here's my issues with that. It's a lot of things going your way that don't always go your way. Will Lando and Max be trading wins every week? No, Max is still going to win, I think, the bulk of the races. So you have Lando finishing second. Okay, cool. As long as Oscar's finishing in the top 5 and, Sergio's 8 through 10, you can still have a play at it. Here's my question. 1, can Oscar do that? 2, Checo's really only had, I'm going to say only 5 bad races this year. He retired in race 3 in Australia, and then only the past 4 weeks have been bad. He goes 8 in Imola, retired Monaco, retired Canada, and then got 8th in Spain. To start the year, he goes 2-2, retire, 2-3-4. What if he goes back to that? If he goes back to that, you don't have a play.
Counterpoint. Checo's really only had 5 bad races this season. I'm sorry. There's been 10 races. So you're telling me that half of this season he's been in the dump? Yeah. I'm not too worried about Checo.
Monaco wasn't his fault. I don't remember what happened in Australia. But if he starts the year, his first 6 races are 2-2, retire, 2-3-4. If he goes back to that, which it's possible, then McLaren doesn't have a play.
Secondary point. Did you know? I don't know if they're leading. I think Williams might still have it, but they're definitely in the top 3. Red Bull has had to spend some of the most money of any of the other teams on fixing the car, a la Checo.
It's a good thing they already have the 2025 car built.
Meaning no upgrades or weak upgrades, and they're going to have to adjust those funds and say, well, either we bring upgrades for this season or we continue to make advances on the 2025 and 2026 car, which is what they're going to pick. They're going to be fine with what the car is in 2024. They're not going to worry about the upgrades. McLaren, on the other hand, with no DNFs this season, is going full upgrade, full tilt. I expect a lot from them for this season. I'm telling you now, McLaren will probably beat Ferrari and will maybe have a play at Red Bull by the end of the season.
I agree with half of you and disagree with the other. And we'll move on to the second question of that. But our final stance on that whole thing is, we'll follow your logic, if Norris is getting first and second, if Oscar's finishing in the top 5 or 6, and Sergio's pace remains as is, with the possibility that Red Bull has a decreased focus on upgrades this year, yes, they can make a play.
I'm not even saying Lando has to regularly trade wins with Max. I'm saying if he gets one more win the rest of the season and just regularly gets second, and Oscar's regularly getting top 5,
that's a 7 or 8 point gap every race.
With Checo only getting 1
you're
point,
not making that up far down. Remember, if Oscar's getting 5th and Checo's getting 8th, you're not making up that gap on Max getting 7 or 8 every race.
If Checo's getting 8th.
I know. Okay. So
2025.
Do they make, I think they make a run for it in 2025. I really do. I could see Oscar and Lando going 1-2 in several races next year.
We're in agreement on this one. I don't know about Oscar and Lando going 1-2. That's tough because Max is far.
No, not for the season. In a couple of races.
Yeah, in a couple of races. Even that's still tough for me to say because unless Max straight up DNFs, he's going to get first or second. I mean, there's no.
Look at Monaco.
About that. That's fair.
If you quali 1-2 in Monaco, Max couldn't cut up through the field.
But that's also Monaco. There is no cutting up through the field. So
Look at Australia. Max finishes 5th.
That's fair. That's fair. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. Maybe it does happen. Maybe it does happen a couple times. But I will say that I do 100% agree with you on 2025 being their big push, their run for the championship. They're looking to make a play at either Lando or Oscar, more than likely Lando, being McLaren's first drivers champion in forever.
Do you know? Okay, small side note. We don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but do you know how excited they would be if Oscar is the champion next year?
You know who wouldn't be at the team much longer if Oscar won the drivers championship?
Doesn't matter. Do you know how? I'm just saying they would be. That would be their. I mean, obviously they'll push Lando because he's the better driver. But if somehow Oscar just steps into a whole nother level, that would be preferred for
If
them.
Oscar wins the drivers championship in 2025, it's the downfall of McLaren. Because then immediately Lando is looking to make the move to another team, and they have to bring in another unknown to fill that second role. And without Lando's powerhouse and Oscar's powerhouse, there's not going to be that double points all the way up at the top for both drivers for McLaren to force their way up towards the top of the constructors, if not winning the whole thing.
I see the same though from Oscar. If Lando wins, then you're clearly the second guy forever.
Not forever. Oscar is just by waiting his time. He knows far and few between. He knows by far Lando right now is the better driver, and he's fine with that. Why? Because he has a higher ceiling, and he knows that it's only a matter of time. It might not be this season or next season, but the season after that, and then maybe the season after that, he's going to be on par, if not maybe slightly faster than Lando.
So we know two key things about next year concerning Red Bull. One, Checo's back. Two, Newey's gone. That both plays into McLaren's favor. And you know, I've been standing by Checo for a long time. I did find it a little bit confusing that they re-signed him.
Yeah.
So aggressively, might I add, like at this point in the season and what seems like a multi-year deal. It was baffling because there's good drivers available right now, which
Carlos
we didn't have
Sainz.
last year. We didn't have any drivers available. This year, there's plenty to go around. And then Newey leaving. Now, again, they probably have the bulk of 25 done already, but that's going to have some impact on the car next year for Red Bull. I think McLaren has, I'll give it 50-50 on who wins next year.
I think they'll have the 2025 car set in stone, but will they have the upgrades to keep them at the top? That's the question.
That's the tough part. Yeah, that's the chance, because we saw that kind of play out with Aston, where
Exactly.
You get the initial car design by kind of stealing Red Bull's folks, but then the upgrades didn't match, and so
Right.
you fell off a little bit. I'll put it at 50-50. What do you give McLaren next year? The odds of we won't do both of these, but the odds of either them winning the drivers or winning the constructors, because it's up in the air.
It's tough because we've seen massive leaps and bounds from Ferrari this season compared to the season prior. And then Mercedes is also, with the upgrades they just recently brought in these past two races, that's now propelled them to podiums in the last two races. So you can't really take them two out of the equation for 2025. I think instead of it being a McLaren Red Bull showdown for the championship, I think we're going to have four teams competing, meaning we're going to have George Russell, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, and Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari all competing for that championship. Now, keep in mind, I didn't say Oscar there. That's for a reason. I think he's just not there yet. Not there yet. And the number 2 at Mercedes is an unknown. That is true. But whoever it is, it's going to be their first year in it, and they're not going to be prepared for a battle for the championship. Also, the number 2 for Red Bull, Checo, he's not going to be in that fight. I'm telling you, it's going to be Max, Lewis, Charles, Lando, and George all duking it out for that drivers' championship. And the constructors, I have no idea. If I had to guess, I think the constructors is going to be a battle between Ferrari and McLaren, just because they're the only two teams of the teams I just listed that have for sure's 1 and 2s that are really good.
So before going to 26, that was going to be my last question to you. Does McLaren have a better shot next year of winning the drivers at constructors? I say constructors.
I
still think Max can get the drivers.
I think Ferrari's going to put up a fight with the 1-2 punch of Lewis and Charles. Sergio is going to be non-existent because of this pure power from the other teams. George is not going to have the team power to go for it in the constructors. maybe the drivers, but doubt that. I guess I'd give them the constructors, but that's a hard sell because the competition is going to be huge.
I think both Lando and Oscar can regularly beat Sergio, but I don't think Lando can regularly beat Max enough. That's the only difference here is beating Max. Like that's the only reason I'm giving them the constructors is it's
And
Max.
we've seen when Ferrari brings the same level of car as the Red Bull, we've seen Charles be dang near on the same level as Max.
We've seen Carlos win.
Right. But I'm talking more specifically of the 2022 season where Charles and Max were quite literally trading wins. When Ferrari provides Charles with a car that allows him to fight with Max, Charles and Max is a nasty fight. So if Ferrari can come back and bring a car in 2025 that brings the fight to Max, Charles is going to go for it. And Lewis isn't just going to sit back and let it happen either. He's going to go for it. And you have Lando right now going for it against Max, so that's only going to carry on into 2025. It's a hard sell for me to say Max is going to win the championship again in 2025. That's tough for me to say.
So we'll wrap up with this.
Oh,
is it all for
26?
Yeah, is it all for naught? Because that's what we're wrapping up with. Because everything changes. The cars, if y'all haven't looked already, go just run a Google on the 2026 regulations. They're different cars. They are smaller by a little bit. They have different engine to battery power ratios than they've had before. They're still going to be over 1,000 horsepower. They're still going to be. I think they're still turbo V6s. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
There's less engine horsepower though, and there's more battery power coming into play. DRS gone. You now have active aero. Welcome to that.
Yeah.
There's no more little wheel. What are the wheel flap cover things called? The fins, whatever they are. No more of those. The wheelbase is smaller. It is a different car entirely. Wasn't there a ground effect thing too to get rid of porpoising, something to that effect?
I want to say they got rid of ground effects. I could be wrong on that.
So you throw whatever car that you've been working on for the past 4, 5, 6 seasons, you throw the whole thing away and you start over. None of that carries over. So with McLaren, does this just put you right back down to where you were, being the 4th, 5th team on the grid every year?
Here's my thoughts. Every time that there's a rules and regulations change, one team nails it, and it's just one. And then the next 5 years are spent the other teams catching their way back up towards the top to whatever team nailed it. I mean, you can look back at Mercedes when the turbo hybrid era started. You can look at Red Bull in the new ground effects and everything else. One team is going to nail it. That's for sure. I have confidence in McLaren just because all of those team changes that you were mentioning earlier, you were saying 2023, 2024. That just happened, which means as we roll into 2026, that is their time to shine. That is their time to put everything together. Now you got to remember Red Bull just lost Adrian Newey. We don't know where he's going to go. There's speculation of Ferrari, which is always exciting.
Audi's coming into the scene.
Audi's coming into the scene, but I don't know if they're going to have the money or technology or even experience to compete at the front right off the bat. But it is an exciting entry for sure. So it's up in the air. I think McLaren has a good shot just because they're young and they're figuring it out now, which means that they're going to be a cohesive unit come their rule change in 26.
Okay, let us know in the comments. Does McLaren have a play in 2024 or 2025?
Guys, if you think that they've had it with Lando, had it with Oscar Piastri, they dump both of them and they go for some backmarker drivers like Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, I think you're wild for saying that. And I don't know if I agree with you.
I was trying to think of a funny driver to say, and I was going to be like Bottas and Joe, and then I was like, no, let's say the Alpine drivers. And then you said the Alpine drivers. Perfect. All right, we'll see ya.
Bye, guys.